BBC World Service. This is Helena Merriman with The Inquiry. This week, has the war on drugs been lost? On Tuesday the 24th of February, on an icy afternoon in Girdwood, Alaska, people started turning up at an apartment. According to the Alaska Dispatch News, they were asked for a password at the door before being shown in. In one smoky corner, a man called Mr. Animal strummed his guitar. In another, people decorated in marijuana leaves were tucking into the cannabis garlic bread, while those in the kitchen cooked up pot pesto. Apart from all the smoke, there was a mood of celebration in the air. Alaska had, that day, followed Colorado and Washington to become the third US state to legalise recreational marijuana. And this was a legalisation party.
We're celebrating freedom. We're celebrating a choice some of us make that aren't criminals.
I think it's a step in the right direction, and it's just a bunch of people here to celebrate that.
Legalization Day, the end of Prohibition, this is a monumental day.
Happy Legalization Day.
Oregon is next up in July, and other states are expected to follow. And the US isn't the only place where drug laws are being relaxed. Jamaica has just decriminalised the possession of marijuana for personal use. Portugal decriminalised drugs 10 years ago. And just over 1 year ago, Uruguay became the first country to make it legal to grow, sell and consume marijuana. So what happened to the war on drugs? This week, we ask, has it been lost?
Part 1. War Weary.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
That was President Richard Nixon declaring war on drugs in 1971, a war which has been led by the US ever since. As the fight ramped up in the late 70s, with task forces breaking up smuggling rings and American pilots flying up and down the Colombian coast, our first expert witness was at university.
When I went to college, I saw plenty of kids using cocaine, and there was a tremendous amount of hysteria at that time, that this was the new frontier which we had to fight.
This is Bonnie Clapper. She went on to become a foot soldier in the war. It was dangerous work.
Most of my career was spent prosecuting for the U.S. Attorney's Office. I loved the work of being a prosecutor, the whole thrill of the investigation.
During her 28 years as a prosecutor, Bonnie Clapper investigated hundreds of drug users and traffickers, from
street level, ultimately going all the way up to the Norte Valle cartel, which at that time was the most prolific and violent cartel in Colombia. And then towards the end of my career, we sort of followed the drugs. So the movement shifted from Colombia to Mexico.
But somewhere along the way, something happened to Bonnie Clapper.
About 10 years into my career, it really hit me that the people I was prosecuting were not just drug traffickers. They were mothers, they were fathers, and I really began to take an interest in why these individuals got involved in drug trafficking.
Individuals such as one Colombian drug runner whose story had a big impact on her.
His family had a very small farm, a ranch with cows, and at 14 he had a choice: go work in the emerald mines or do something else. So he started in the emerald mines, which is often a last resort for poverty-stricken people in Colombia, and it was a horrible, horrible experience, and then was offered the chance to work as a driver for one of the leaders of the Norte Valle cartel. Started as a driver and ultimately rose up through the ranks.
When he found out about Bonnie Clapper's investigation into the cartel, he surrendered. A rare occurrence, she says. She then spent hundreds of hours talking to him, finding out about his life.
In countries like Colombia, sometimes if you want to support your family and you don't come from a wealthy family or you're not highly educated, drugs is the only path that you have to get yourself out of poverty.
For many poor Colombians, drugs had become a lucrative career path. The prospect of jail wasn't much of a deterrent. Back in Queens, in New York, she noticed other problems with the war on drugs.
My agent, Romerio, and I would prosecute money remitter houses in Queens that were sending drug money to Colombia. We prosecuted one, we shut it down, and the next day another one opened up in the same location. Or we prosecuted very high-level traffickers either in the United States or in Colombia, and once they were extradited, someone else came in to take their place. We've shifted the problem from Colombia to Mexico. Now all of Central America is inundated because the traffickers got sophisticated and they're moving through Guatemala and Honduras, and those countries are turning into narco states.
It's called the balloon effect. Squeeze down in one place and the problem pops up somewhere else. So life as a prosecutor became increasingly frustrating for her. She felt she couldn't do her job properly in a system with rigid rules about sentencing drug users. Then, after a cartel sent a man to kill her, she decided enough was enough. The foot soldiers switched sides, and she became a defence attorney, giving her a view on the war on drugs from the inside.
The prison system is a disaster. Now as a defense attorney, I'm in jail. If my father could hear me say that, I'm in jail most of the time. And there's virtually no rehabilitation. Locking up low-level individuals who have drug problems or who have limited other options is not effective, because they go to jail, they come out, they get involved with drugs again, and they go right back to it.
Do you think that there's a growing recognition within government that the war against drugs, as it's been fought in the last 40 years, has failed?
When I was a prosecutor, I never really heard that recognition. I actually hear it more nowadays with the agents that I work with in my capacity as a defense attorney. So many of them have said to me, we're fighting a war that can't be won the way we're fighting it. I have nothing but praise for the law enforcement agents I've worked with, but the war itself is at a draw, and I believe that the standstill or the draw will be maintained indefinitely unless there's a dramatic change in our approach to drugs and drug trafficking.
And a dramatic change is exactly what our next expert witness is calling for.
Part 2. Breaking Ranks.
Ten years ago was unthinkable that we could talk openly about these issues. 10 years ago was unthinkable that the U.S. will move massively to the legalization of cannabis. I think that taboo has been broken.
This is Cesar Gaviria, a former president of Colombia. He's one of those who helped break that taboo of drug legalization. In 2011, he worked on the Global Commission on Drug Policy report, which declared the war against drugs a failure. End the criminalization of drug users, the report said. It was a striking moment. 22 former presidents and UN leaders declaring the drug war lost. And, for Cesar Gaviria, it was the culmination of quite a story.
It has been a big personal journey, no doubt.
Cesar Gaviria's presidency ran from 1990 to 1994.
Politics became a very dangerous activity those years because many people lost their lives. I mean, anyone that was not on the sides of the cartels was taking a big risk.
He knows more than most what those risks were. In 1989, still a presidential candidate, he was about to board Avianca Airlines Flight 203.
We changed 2 hours before our plans.
5 minutes after taking off, a bomb placed near the fuel tank exploded at 13,000 feet. The airliner went down in flames, killing all 107 people on board. The last-minute change of plan had saved his life.
It's a show of how crazy that moment was. I mean, it's probably the only case in history in which a plane is brought down to try to kill a person.
The man behind the assassination attempt? Pablo Escobar, the infamous drug lord, thought to be responsible for as many as 4,000 deaths in Colombia. Cesar Gaviria says that unless the US changes the way it tackles drugs, more people will die.
There are thousands of people killed in Mexico, Central America, Colombia, and we don't want that. I think the US should move faster so we can save lives.
So is your argument that the US should eventually legalize and regulate all drugs?
Our recommendation is regulation for everything. That's what Portugal did. If you look at the last 50 years, what has been done in the U.S., 600,000 people in jail, $40 billion of spending a year, the highest rates of consumption of the whole world, you have to say that it doesn't work. It's a failed policy. And public opinion knows that. In the U.S., a majority of people are talking about approving legalization of marijuana.
One by one, countries are now pulling away from the war on drugs. They're experimenting and taking risks. Take Uruguay, the first country to legalize the marijuana trade.
I think all Latin America is looking at Uruguay. It's a country also that look how to deal with the production, with the supply of the marijuana that is in the state hands. I don't expect any major setback of the policy that the Uruguayans have put in place.
In many cases, it's too early to know what effect these experiments are having. But what's clear is that the rhetoric is changing. Less talk of war.
Almost no country today rejects that idea that it should be a health problem.
A health problem, in contrast to viewing drugs as a crime issue. In other words, spending more money on treatment and prevention programs for drug users rather than on arrests, illicit crop eradication and drug seizures. But some veterans of the war on drugs say it has not been lost.
Part 3. Fighting On.
Colombia was a powerful experience for me because it's such a majestic country. You fly over portions of ungoverned spaces out in the Amazonian basin or in the Andean highlands, and you see a lot of people were growing cocaine and growing coca plants, very often at the threat of a gun.
This is David Murray. He was the chief scientist in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy from 2001 until last year. If the fight against drugs has been a war, he was one of its generals. He's describing his first trips to Colombia, where he saw what America was up against.
To see the chemical plants up in the high hills where people were turning coca paste into cocaine, and to see the endless fear for a people who wished to move into legitimate economies but were prevented from doing so, it was just heartbreaking.
While Mr. Murray was in office, the US spent billions of dollars training and equipping Colombian forces to take on drug traffickers and destroy coca crops. Money well spent, he says.
A 75% reduction in the productive capacity of Colombian cocaine was achieved by strategic initiatives of supply reduction in partnership with the leadership and political will of the Colombians themselves. That's been a sustained achievement that then resulted in a more than 45% drop in the prevalence rate of cocaine use in the United States on the streets.
But what about the balloon effect that we heard about earlier?
This is a very common critique. Some truth to it. It pushes down here, it just pops up over there. The whole thing is a futile Sisyphean, perhaps. But hang on a second. This is a global business. As a global business, they have their preferred mode of operation, where they would like to be with regard to supply routes, ungoverned safe havens, where they would like to be to carry out their business with maximum efficiency to deliver drugs. When you push them off of that spot, they will adapt, but they are diminished, and oftentimes the problem is smaller.
Keep squeezing that balloon, he says, and the air will seep out. The war against drugs must continue.
We may have an idealized world where prevention and treatment and recovery happen in a certain way, and we don't have to do the hard and dirty work. But that's not the reality on the ground. The reality is it's a tough slog. It is a cancer, and it is worth fighting. Sure, it's discouraging to see drug use continue, but it actually is diminished if you take a long perspective over time, and we actually are making progress with regard to it.
So has the war on drugs been lost? Our first expert witness says it's at a standstill. Our second says it has been lost. Our third says the war must go on. And it appears that it is. Despite President Obama's announcement that drugs would now be seen as a health problem rather than a law enforcement issue, the money tells a different story. His budget request for 2016 reveals that more of the drug control money will fund law enforcement and eradication programs than will go to treatment and prevention. So does that mean the drugs war will continue? Is it just the rhetoric that's changing?
Part 4. Choose your battles.
I think the war on drugs was partly defined by its rhetoric.
Meet our final expert witness, Peter Reuter, professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. 25 years ago, he founded the Drug Policy Unit at one of the top think tanks in America, the RAND Corporation.
The need for national leaders to stand up and talk about the scourge of drugs and signal to the population that being tough on drugs was a priority. I think that was an important part of the war itself. And I think there's going to be less and less of that. So I think that there's going to be a change both in tone and substance so that the war on drugs will become a less and less plausible metaphor for describing policy.
And what will the new metaphor be?
I think that that's a good question. I think it's going to be a public health rhetoric for the foreseeable future.
If he's right, why is the majority of the US government's drug control budget going to law enforcement, not treatment and prevention?
Most of the money goes to enforcement, and that's true even in tolerant countries like the Netherlands. Investigating, prosecuting, and locking up drug dealers is an expensive business. Prevention is pretty cheap, and harm reduction's even cheaper. So if all you're looking at is money, you're not really going to see the changes.
Look past the funding at what's actually happening in US prisons, he says, and you'll notice something new.
If you look at the number of people who are in prison for drug offences, at least in the US, that's an important indicator of the change in real policy. And those numbers are starting to go down, not dramatically, but they are definitely going down. And many states are making changes that are likely to accelerate that decline.
So the US war on drugs is changing, which means that new fronts are opening up. With the softening of drug laws, one of these new battles will be over-regulation. Peter Reuter has been looking at the lessons from the legalisation of other vices. Take gambling.
Lottery play was always seen as a sort of bad thing. You legalised it because you wanted to take money away from organised crime, but the result was that the state lotteries became the most aggressive promoters. You have slogans like, why be a mug and work when you can play the lottery and win easily? I mean, just the kind of slogan you'd associate with the worst commercial promotion, but it was done by the state.
Having posters for casinos or gambling is one thing, but do you really think it's likely that you could have posters for marijuana or cocaine, given the health risks?
Absolutely. Let's not exaggerate the health risks of marijuana. It is less of a health risk than alcohol or smoking. And alcohol is still heavily promoted, and it's promoted in states that have state liquor monopolies. And we've only recently really been able to restrict smoking promotion, so I think there's considerable risk that even if there was a monopoly, there would be promotion of marijuana. And clearly, what we see in the state of Colorado, where it is commercially available, is regulated like alcohol, what we see is very aggressive promotion, advertising. You cannot, with a straight face, say that marijuana legalization won't lead to more marijuana dependence. That's a problem, but it replaces other problems.
So what's the solution?
Choose your problem. There is no solution. Use of psychoactive drugs is a social problem like a whole lot of other social problems. We manage it, and we may manage it better or worse, but the notion that we solve a problem is simplistic. We're simply managing a problem.
Do you think we're learning to manage it better?
Yes, I do believe that we have, in a sense, had an experiment with trying to be very aggressive about controlling drugs through use of prohibition. And we have a sense that that did not work well. And so we're now trying to find better ways of managing the problem. And I think that's welcome and will take decades to work through.
Managing the problem. A very different prospect to fighting a war against it. So is it time to stop talking about a war on drugs? Even veterans of the war, like David Murray, admit that it might be.
I would quickly and gladly trade it for some other phrase that would be more apt, more compelling. Do you win? Do you prevail? Does drug-abusing behavior simply disappear? And my sense is probably not. Can you gain traction and can you make the problem smaller? Can you make it more manageable?
From the beginning in 1961, the objective of the UN conventions have been to live in a world free of drugs. But it's an utopia. It's something unreachable. It's not to recognize human nature. That will never happen. The objectives are unreachable and are an utopia.
For thousands of years, human beings have sought pleasure from recreational stimulants. In thinking that these could be limited to nicotine and alcohol, the pioneers of the war on drugs started a war that couldn't be won. The rhetoric around that war may be changing faster than policy, but it's clear that in the US, as in many parts of the world, drugs are beginning to be seen as a problem to be managed, not one that can be defeated. And so in that sense, the war on drugs has been lost.
The Inquiry is produced in London by Simon Mabin and Phoebe Keane. The editor is Richard Knight. Previous editions are available on our website. If you liked this one about drug policy, check out the one there about drug politics called Who Runs Mexico? We want to know what you want to know, so demand an inquiry via the World Service Facebook page or on Twitter at BBC The Inquiry.